It's easy to look at a world map and think, yeah, that's it. That's how the world is. Like those borders are set in stone, right? But they're not at all. Countries can and absolutely do break apart. They splinter from the inside out. So today, we're going to dive into the really powerful forces that are constantly redrawing the map we think we know so well. So, why is that? Why do some nations seem to just fracture and fall apart, while others stay rock solid? It's definitely not random. It turns out there's this really powerful geopolitical process at work here, a force that can weaken even the biggest, strongest countries from within. And that process, it has a name: devolution. And really, it's pretty simple. It's the transfer of power from a central, national government down to smaller, regional ones. Now, this can look like a lot of different things. It could just be giving a region a little more say in its own affairs, or it can go all the way to a full-blown breakup of the country. This idea is absolutely key if you want to understand why nations sometimes unravel. Okay, so what actually causes a country to go down this path? Well, we can pretty much group the reasons into three big categories. First up, let's talk about the forces of identity. This is all about what happens when people feel a much, much stronger connection to their local culture, their language, or their ethnic group than they do to the idea of the nation itself. A perfect example of this is Belgium. I mean, this is a country that's literally split right down the middle by language. You've got Flanders in the north, where they speak a form of Dutch, and then you've got Wallonia in the south, which is French-speaking. And for a lot of people there, that local identity, being Flemish or Walloon, is way more important than being Belgian. And that's why you hear these constant calls for the country to just split in two. And sometimes, these identity divides run even deeper, leading to something called ethnic separatism. A really clear and tragic example is Sudan. Its borders were basically just drawn on a map by British colonials, mashing a mostly Arab north and a mostly African south together into one country. The friction, the cultural and ethnic clashes, it was immense. It led to two absolutely devastating civil wars, and in the end, the ultimate form of devolution. The South voted for its own independence and created a brand new country, South Sudan. All right, let's move on to our second big category. This is all about the forces of place and money. Because you know what? It isn't always about culture and identity. Sometimes it's things like physical distance, huge natural barriers, or just cold, hard cash that can pull a country apart at the seams. I mean, physical geography can be a huge isolating force. Just look at the Basque people in Spain. They live in this region that's basically walled off from the rest of the country by the Pyrenees Mountains. And for centuries, that isolation meant they could hang on to their own unique language and culture, something totally different from the rest of Spain. That powerful sense of being separate, well, it ended up fueling some really strong independence movements. So strong, in fact, that the Spanish government had to grant them a ton of autonomy just to relieve the pressure and keep the country in one piece. And then, of course, there's the money. Let's stay in Spain for a second and look at Catalonia. It's one of the country's richest regions, a real economic powerhouse. And this powerful idea started to spread, this feeling of, hey, wait a minute, why is our tax money being used to prop up poorer parts of Spain? We could do so much better on our own. And that feeling, that idea that you're economically self-sufficient, man, that is a powerful, powerful driver for wanting full independence. Okay, that brings us to our third and honestly most volatile category, the forces of conflict. This is where things get really serious. This is when devolution isn't driven by debates or economics. It's driven by violence, by oppression, and by bitter disputes over who owns what land. I think one of the most tragic examples of this has to be the breakup of Yugoslavia. So after World War I, you had all these rival ethnic groups, Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, all just forced together into a single country. Fast forward to the 1990s, and regions start pushing for their own independence. The response from the Serbian leader at the time, Slobodan Milosevic, was a horrific campaign of ethnic cleansing. And the result? A brutal, devastating war, and the complete and total fragmentation of the country. Another major driver of conflict is a concept called irredentism. It's basically when one country tries to claim a piece of another country because they argue that the people living there are ethnically the same as them. And the most obvious recent example of this is Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine back in 2014. Russia's whole justification was, hey, most of the people in Crimea are ethnically Russian, they should be part of their motherland. And that one act put an absolutely immense amount of devolutionary pressure on the state of Ukraine. And finally, we have to talk about terrorism as a brutal tool for devolution. You can look at groups like the IRA in Northern Ireland. They used violence for decades, trying to force the British government to grant them independence. Now, in the end, it didn't create a whole new country. But that intense pressure did lead to a form of devolution. The UK transferred a lot more power to a regional parliament in Northern Ireland. So let's just recap for a second. We've got these three huge drivers of devolution, right? First, you have these deep-seated issues of identity. Then, you've got the practical realities of place and money. And finally, the incredibly explosive force of conflict. And what's really important to get is that these things don't exist in a vacuum. They overlap. A geographic divide can make a cultural one feel even deeper, and economic anger can easily boil over into actual conflict. And if there's one thing you take away from all this, I hope it's this. Devolution isn't some historical event that's over and done with. No way. It is a live, powerful, ongoing process. These exact same pressures we've been talking about, cultural, economic, conflict-driven, they are bubbling up in countries all over the globe right now as we speak, constantly reshaping the world map. Which really just leaves us with one last big question. The next time you look at a world map and you think about all these forces we just talked about, which of the borders you see today do you think will be tomorrow's history?